Wow, I've got a really tough job, haven't I, at the end of the day too, so it's really hard to... but what powerful presenters these young people are, and just gives me heart as someone in my later age, probably not too old, but in my later age, that we've got young people like this taking on the leadership role in our community, and I feel really, really proud to be part of this room with you today to hear you speak and your vision and about what you want to change. Fantastic. The mental health component, I think you knew the issues better than I do, so that, I thought, Grace, you covered it really well. You know exactly what's needed. I think, picking up all of the stuff that, that you've mentioned, particularly, I think the elements around being led, being co-designed, being managed by people with lived experience is a critical aspect. Historically, and you quoted me, and I use that quote pretty regularly, so you must have heard me say this a few times because I have said it, but everywhere I go, people will tell me, in addition to the quote that you used before about why do all roads lead to inpatient care, is that people say to me, you've developed the service, because obviously I was part of Queensland Health at the time, said, you've developed the services where you want to work, not the services that meets our needs. And so that really rings in my bell in terms of what you were saying, and sort of rings a bell in my mind about that we've got to rethink how we're delivering services. And that whole shift that you talked about from, from hospital to community, people in situ, people in family, in community, support services early. Where do you prevent things rather than actually wait for the crisis to occur? And then the experiences you talked about, inpatient care. I think they're the critical aspects in the mental health reform agenda. I suppose my only bit of good news is that I think we're on the journey, but we are early on the journey. I can tell you there's a lot of work to be done. We have made some major shifts, but I think there's still a lot to go. But you've got exactly what needs to be done, and I look forward to people like yourself and others continuing to drive both myself but also the whole system for change. Alice, your personal experience, your health experience, but the elements of that, which obviously had an impact on you about your social isolation and your loneliness in this whole journey, is a critical aspect. And both in terms of physical health and recovery, but also mental health, loneliness and isolation are really critical aspects that we don't, I think, address adequately in our community and society. We had a whole parliamentary inquiry here about loneliness and social isolation. There is a recognition that we've got to do more about that we all as humans live in a village, and we want to live in a village rather than in social isolation. What I also liked about you, sort of self-love stuff, about, feeling good about yourself, loving yourself. And I think they're critical aspects, and those resources that you talked about, but also the support, the peer support that you talked about, are critical aspects, both from a physical health recovery, but also from a mental health, in a healthy mentally mind, if I can put it that way, to be able to cope with particularly some of the physical treatment aspects that you went through. So I think you're on the money, and I think it's an area that we've got to push much more. I actually get a sense, and I'm maybe making a gross generalisation here, that in the larger, bigger cities, we have lost that concept of social connection. We are very much individuals. We don't even know who our neighbours are. We don't know. And in fact, we don't care whether our neighbours have food on the table tonight or not. That's not our business. But I get a sense in regional Queensland we still have an element of that. It's still stronger than in the larger sort of urban areas. And I think there's something for us to think about. How do we recreate some of those communities that we have common care for each other and feel socially connected and not isolated? I think you're on the money, and I think we've got to keep pushing this whole concept about tackling social isolation and loneliness. And it was interesting in the data that came out that we think that social isolation and loneliness is only an issue for elderly people like myself. But it's in fact, one of the highest rates, and the increasing rates was amongst young people. And even though my phone's over there, we're supposedly socially connected through our different chats and online and sort of things, it's not meeting that need of social connection. In fact, it's having, I would suggest, and I think the evidence is starting to mount, it's having a negative impact on social connection and isolation. In terms of, so thank you very much for sharing that. I think, again, if we can continue to push particularly young people, but generally we can all push around addressing loneliness and social isolation, both, as you say, in the hospital community, but also externally is so critical. So thank you for driving that. Miles, in terms of the concept of young people and disability in schools, what I did like about what you said, that, we need to have access to both, as you say, safe and quality services for young people in education. I think they're critical aspects. And when I hear you reflecting around the NDIS, etc., at the moment, that seems to be driven by the NDIS primarily, that if you get a package, then you're sort of okay, and the school does certain things because you've got money to be able to pay for certain things. But the reality is not everyone's going to get an NDIS package. And in fact, we need to think about how do we actually provide supports to people outside even the NDIS through the education system. Because the education system is also struggling to provide the support that young people with various disabilities need and have. But there isn't another bucket of money now that we can use to support young people, particularly with disabilities. Can I say with the NDIS, and the government just did a major review of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, what I like about some of the thinking is that rather than only people and young people with severe disabilities, including mental health and physical disabilities, when you're at the severe end, you probably will qualify for a package. They're actually talking about now, the review said about early intervention. You might get a smaller, less package early to help you deal with some of these things rather than waiting for a crisis to occur. I think that's a really good move, but also, which is probably even better than that there's a recognition now that between the Commonwealth and the state that not everybody's going to get an NDIS package. What about the hundreds of thousands of people that don't? How do we actually now, they're calling it foundational support, how do the state and the Commonwealth now fund together young people, people generally with disabilities in education, out of education, to have the support they need, not through the NDIS, but through Commonwealth state-funded joint services, critical. But the highest growth in terms of disability, NDIS particularly, and the costs, the highest increase is really young people with autism on the autism spectrum. By far the biggest increase. And in fact, the government had projected initially when this was sort of set up that it was going to be costing the government about, 450,000 people, costing about 23, 24, maybe $25 billion maximum. We're currently on $42 billion in terms of the cost of the NDIS. So there's a whole rethink about, are we just providing more services to a smaller group of people, and a large group of people who used to get services before through various ways are really missing out now, and they're the largest group. So I think there's an opportunity with this review to address some of those needs that you talked about. But I think it's a really important issue that we've got to keep on top of and keep raising about general disability, including, as we say, in mental health, psychosocial disability, but physical, cognitive impairments, etc. We've got to think about how do we support young people, particularly in the education sector. So please keep up that fight. And we're certainly doing what we can to drive that as well. And finally, to Siobhan, alcohol and all the stuff that you spoke about. That data is phenomenal. You know the topic better than I do. A little bit of good news. If I can just say that. Overall, the rate of alcohol consumption generally in the community, including young people, is on the way down. Generally. But you pick up a really good point. And it's a really tough one to tackle because it's part of our DNA in Australia and a lot of communities and a lot of countries around the world. Alcohol is part of our social fabric. But as you rightfully say, it has major implications. And not to talk about a whole range of other things, but even just the family impacts, as you talked about. And if you think about, and I know Michael's here, and some of the work we're doing generally about, we talk about those early years and the development of young people, etc. If a child grows up in one of those adverse childhood experience families where there's a whole range of problems, including drug and alcohol use and misuse, etc., their trajectory for poor mental health and physical health is pretty much set. We've got data for 25 years following young people. So tackling alcohol is a really big issue for us, and it's really hard because it's a cultural norm. And I think these are the sorts of things, how do we actually change some of that in terms of what you're saying? And you've got some really, good ideas around warnings and a whole range of things. The problem, and we've done some work in the alcohol because we're also responsible for both illicit substances, but also working around, minimising harm from both illicit substances, but also alcohol. Historically, before COVID, we were doing some work around, and there is a map around, how many outlets of alcohol you should have per catchments of population. And we were trying to look at how do you minimise that, because if your BWS is down the road and it's accessible, whatever, there's various sort of attractions to that to be able to access, sort of alcohol, particularly in a really easy way. So we were looking at how do you actually impact in what the distribution of those outlets is, and then COVID came, and now people are ordering alcohol online. So all that work that we did to try and minimise and reduce and all that sort of stuff, but now you ring up and you get 6 bottles delivered to your front door. So it's about how do we manage that in this current environment to be able to, all those warnings and things that you put, but it's the accessibility as well that I think is really critical. But I think we've got to stay on top of it, both illicit substances and sort of alcohol. And alcohol is 3 times more of a problem than illicit substances in Queensland, even though you will see, mainly in the media, around a whole range of drugs and things, in certain communities, but alcohol is 3 times more the problem. But we don't have the cultural will and the cultural norm and the leadership to actually drive some of that change. So thank you all four for that fantastic presentation. And I think if we could achieve some of the things that all 4 of you have actually talked about, and your insights and some solutions, I think we would be in a much better world and a much better community and a much better Queensland. So thank you very much.
Incredible.